This video is going to walk you through how to answer question 4. A lot of students really struggle with this question because they don't know how to approach it. You really should be giving this question your priority though, as it's worth 16 marks, which means that you need to be spending a good 24 minutes answering this question. A lot of students make the mistake of spending too long on question 1, 2 and 3 and then rushing through, or even, in worst case scenario, completely leaving question 4 out, which is a really bad mistake to make because those marks that are available on question 4 can lift you a whole grade or even 2 grades. So you really need to make sure that you know exactly what to do to get the most marks that you can for question 4. A lot of students really struggle to do what the question is asking them to do, which is to compare the ways that language is used for effect in two texts, and then give some examples and analyse their effects. So it's asking you to look at the words and the phrases that are written in the sources in order to comment on how they are intended to affect the reader. Why has the author chosen those words, and what effect are they aiming to have on the reader? So if we look at the mark scheme here, to get a band 4, what you need to be doing is doing perceptive and detailed analysis of language. Lots of students really get stuck on band 2, which is some attempts, and that's just because they don't refer closely enough to the text. They don't pick out quotes, they don't pick out words, and they don't explain them. So it actually is very easy indeed to get a band 3. All you've got to do is actually pick out words and phrases and then explain what effect the author is trying to have on the reader, and it's as easy as that. The question asks you to refer to source 3. Source 3 is usually quite a descriptive text, and so it makes much more sense to write the most about this source. So when you read your sources, I would spend the most time highlighting and annotating this source, and then choose the other source that you're going to compare it to, depending on which one you think you can say the most about. But it doesn't matter if you say less about that source than the original source 3 that the exam board has named for you to focus on. When you're revising for question 4, it's important to make sure that you remember that these are the things that you must avoid doing at all costs for question 4. Question 4 is not asking you to write about presentational devices. You won't get any marks for talking about the pictures, for talking about font, for talking about the way that the text is laid out. It's also worth mentioning that there aren't any marks available in the mark scheme for commenting on sentence length and punctuation. A lot of students comment intelligently on the sentence length and punctuation, but you are being asked to comment on the language, so there aren't any marks available for talking about this. The other massive mistake that students make is to use empty phrases and general explanations. So you make a point, you use your evidence to back up that point, but then you give a very vague explanation like this makes the reader want to read on, or this makes the word stand out. That kind of explanation could be applied to any text. You have got to make sure that your explanations are specific to the text in front of you. The next thing you're going to want to do is to decide which two sources that you're going to compare. So it's told me that I have to compare source 3, so that's fine. And then I read source 1 and 2, and for the purpose of this video I've decided that I think that I can say more about source 2 in terms of comparison. So I'm choosing these two sources. So what I would do is I'd turn to the front of my exam paper and have a look at where these sources have come from. So source 2 is an article. That means it's probably appeared in some sort of magazine or newspaper, and it's called Forget the X Factor, Mongolia's Got Talons. I'm comparing it to The Motorbikes and Pyramids, which is an extract from a non-fiction book by Ewan McGregor. So it's kind of autobiographical, and I expect it's going to be very descriptive before I've even read it. So you need to know where these two sources have come from so that when you write your brief introduction, you can really explain what the purpose of both texts are, and then you can comment on why the language is used to meet that purpose. So here are the two texts that I'm going to compare. It's worth noting that before you even start writing your comparison answer, what I would do is I would jot down some comparative connectives that you've revised, just so that as you're writing your answer, you can structure it well and you can use these connectives that are going to show the examiner that you are indeed comparing the two texts, which is exactly what the mock scheme is asking you to do. A lot of the time in the exams you get given a first paragraph that's written in italics. It's important to make sure that you read this because it puts the text into context. So here it says, Hugh McGregor and Charlie Borman are making a TV film about riding their motorbikes from Scotland to South Africa. Here they're in Egypt but are behind schedule. So having read that, I can understand what's going on, and I imagine that everything that's written is going to be emphasising that situation that they're in. Having read the rest of the extract then I'm going to ask myself to sum up what the extract's about. So to put it into simple terms, I'm going to say something like, Source 3 is about Ewan McGregor's experience of seeing the pyramids for the first time. Then in a similar way, I'm going to read Source 2 and sum up again what it's about. As Source 2 is a newspaper article, it's more informative and it's got more factual information in it. The article informs the reader all about how in Mongolia they have an annual event to show off their golden eagles. I'm now going to use my comparative connectives to write a really brief introduction which shows the examiner that I understand both texts and what the purpose of both texts are. This is an example then of what a brief introduction might look like. Source 3 is a descriptive account of Ewan McGregor's experience of seeing the pyramids for the first time, whereas Source 2 is an informative article about how Mongolia shows off their golden eagles. So here I've shown that I've identified that Source 3 is a descriptive account, and I've also identified that Source 2 is an informative account, and I've also used a comparison connective here to show that straight away I'm thinking comparatively about the two sources. The next thing to do is to read Source 3 carefully and to start thinking about words and phrases that you can comment on. So I'm going to read paragraph 1. Charlie was on my outside and I rode with one hand on the bars and one in my lap, the asphalt true and grippy. For a while it seemed the land was greener, farming country perhaps, but before we knew it there was the sand again, the rubble, piles of rock littered across the horizon. I'm going to underline the word littered, as I feel that it's quite a negative word and I probably want to comment on that at some point during my answer. The next paragraph. I'd been in a very bad mood and it was only just beginning to ease. I wasn't quite sure how our planning had gone awry. It hadn't been like this when we'd rode around the world. I don't remember the level of tension either. We'd had our moments, but this time we seemed to go from one petty squabble to another. Now, I'm going to underline the word petty there because that kind of shows me that it wasn't a serious argument, so I'm going to comment on the word petty. Geezer came up quicker than I expected, so preoccupied was I with my thoughts. All at once the driving worsened, the cars came thick and fast, and we were on the outskirts of the town. Cars were hooting, kids yelling from donkey carts and bicycles. Having read that paragraph, the phrase came thick and fast stands out, and also cars hooting, kids yelling from monkey carts and bicycles. It's all just like really building up the imagery and the noise, so that I definitely want to comment on that when I'm analysing the language. And then there they were, just a glimpse to begin with. They seemed to grow up from the middle of the town itself. It took a moment to dawn. The pyramids, my God, I'd ridden my motorbike all the way to the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Now the way Ewan McGregor's described this experience of seeing the pyramids for the first time, I think is very effective. The fact that he says, my God, might suggest that it's kind of like a religious experience. And we've also got this juxtaposition of his motorbike, which is an everyday mode of transport, to these great pyramids of Egypt. So it's almost like they're next to each other in the same sentence to add emphasis to how great the pyramids are, and then that also links to the title of the article, which is Motorbikes and Pyramids, two things that you don't necessarily see next to each other. If it was in the exam, I'd write the word juxtaposition down the side of my page just so I can remember to use that. If you can use English terminology in your analysis, then you're going to hit the top band criteria if you explain it well enough. Alternatively, you could just say that there's a a contrast between the everyday motorbike and the great wonder of the world, which is the pyramid. Going on to the next paragraph, excitement gripped me. We funnelled into traffic, the building stained a dirty yellow, apartment stalls, people everywhere peering at us, waving. We came to a checkpoint and stopped. It was early evening, the sun just beginning to set. So here again, excitement gripped me. It's almost like excitement is a person hanging on to him, so he's personifying the feeling of excitement. Then the image of funnelling into traffic, it brings to mind a congested city and the fact that they're all like squeezing into narrow roads. It's building up the atmosphere of the city and how busy Egypt is with cars everywhere. Again, you could comment on the contrasts. You've got the dirty, stained, yellow apartment stalls, the people everywhere, contrasted with the sun beginning to set in the beautiful backdrop, which is Egypt. People wandered over to look at the bikes. Mine was hot and sounded pretty gnarly. I switched the engine off. Hey you, and Charlie said, there's a golf course over there. Imagine having a round of golf with the pyramids as your backdrop. I could hear the enthusiasm in his voice. Suddenly all the tension seemed to lift. There's nothing like witnessing one of the great wonders of the world if you want to put your troubles into perspective. When I read this part of the text, I feel like Ewan is really getting across this moment of serenity that he's feeling. So the phrase where he says that he feels like the tension seemed to lift, and the bit where he says that if you see one of the great wonders of the world, it puts your troubles into perspective. It's almost like he's having a cathartic moment, a moment where he feels peace and all of the stress of the busy city and his journey that he's behind schedule on is almost like fades away to nothing compared to this magnificent pyramid that he's looking at. So the next part, moments later we were moving up to a checkered barrier and the pyramids were right ahead of us and not quite as deep in the town as I thought. The road was wide and dusty. It snaked a few hundred yards to where the massive stone structures dominated the skyline. As I passed his truck, Rami, our fixer, was standing there in his Indiana Jones hat. There are a couple of things here that you could comment on. You could comment on it snaked a few hundred yards. I feel like that's a deliberate reference to a snake, which you would find in a desert, and that's exactly where Ewan is. And then he's also describing the pyramids as dominating the skyline, and that emphasises just how important they were and how they stood out to him. So the last part now. All yours, he called. Initially I didn't understand what he meant. Then I realised the area was closed off for the evening, and we were the only visitors. I couldn't believe it. Not only had I ridden my bike to the pyramids, now we had them to ourselves. 2 colossal structures. They lifted from the desert with Cairo on one side and an ancient expanse of nothingness on the other. I was speechless, standing on the foot pegs of my bike, as if in homage. From this paragraph I would pick out the word colossal. That adjective is describing just how massive they are again. I would pick up this phrase, an ancient expanse of nothingness. An expanse of nothingness, it's like an oxymoron. The two things don't go together, they contradict each other, but together they emphasise it. So you could talk about the oxymoron there. And then also the fact that he was standing on his foot pegs of his bike as if in homage. That word there, if you understand what that word means, you need to tell the examiner that you do, because it's to pay respect and it shows that you understand language. So definitely comment on that word. Remember to annotate. Then you need to do the same with the second source. So you read it through and then you pick out things that you can possibly compare it to. So you could talk about a lot of differences. This one's not as descriptive and it's not so much an account of someone's experience, it's more informative. But there are some similarities. So I've picked out here the fact that there's a clear juxtaposition in the title. It's comparing what we're familiar with, so the X Factor, that's what we watch for entertainment in Britain, with Mongolia's entertainment, which is showing off their golden eagles, and there's a definite play on words here. So you've got Mongolia's got talons instead of got talent, and you can explain that, but you can talk about the juxtaposition between the mundane X Factor and the natural golden eagle. It's like two contrasting things next to each other to make the title stand out, to grab the reader's interest and make them want to read on and find out what's going on. Then I've picked out the fact that it's got imagery, just like the images of the Great Pyramids and how they're made to sound dominant and they stand out in Cairo. The golden eagle is made to sound amazing. It's got this wingspan of more than 2.5 metres and claw-like talons to tear at the prey. And then in a similar way that the pyramids are described to inspire awe in the fact that Ewan McGregor really respected those pyramids, you can talk about how the description of these eagles inspires respect. The fact that the dark golden brown plumage on their heads and the necks gave them their name with their impressive wingspans. They can hover in the sky for hours while eyeing up their next meal. All of that description is meant to sound, in fact the word impressive is actually there. It's meant to sound impressive and it's meant to make the reader think how magnificent these creatures are, just like the pyramids are made to sound magnificent in source 3. So here's what a comparative paragraph might look like in your question for answer. Both texts use contrast to engage the reader. In source 3, the title Motorbikes and Pyramids seems quite abstract, as the reader would not necessarily put these two things together. This has the effect of making the reader want to read the article to find out why these two things are next to each other. Similarly, in source 2, juxtaposition is used in the title Forget the X Factor, Mongolia's Got Talons. Here, a clear play on words is used to put the reader in mind of the mundane talent shows that we are used to. However, the word talons refers to the magnificent golden eagles which are described in the article. This has the effect of making the talent show sound even more pathetic. So if we just have a quick look at the mark scheme again, what it's actually asking us to do is to offer a full and detailed understanding of the text in relation to language. So the example that we've just read, we've got 2 quotes, one from each text, and we've commented on the language and we've commented on the technique used by the author. We've used English terminology, we've got juxtaposition in there, so that ticks that box. Then we've got analyses how the writers have used language differently to achieve effects. So we've talked about how next to each other the contrasting things engages the reader and makes them want to find out more about it. So we've ticked that box off. We've got offers appropriate quotations or references in support of our ideas. We've got 2 quotes and we've even got word level analysis there. We've zoomed in on the word talons as well, so I think we can tick that box off. And we've focused on comparison and cross-referencing, so we have actually compared the 2 texts really closely. I think that you could argue that the fact that we've picked out how both titles have got a juxtaposition in there, they've both got a contrast in there, you could argue that that is a perceptive thing to pick out. I think if you're noticing things like that, then you're definitely hitting the top mark band. Finally, it's important to make sure that you've got enough to write. So what I would do is I would jot down an essay plan. So I've already talked about the contrasts in the titles, the contrast between the motorbikes and the pyramids, the contrast between the X Factor and the golden eagle. You could compare the imagery, the language that's used in both articles to put a vivid picture in the reader's mind. So what techniques are used, similes, adjectives, metaphors, anything that you can spot that actually brings whatever the author is describing to life for the reader, you can compare. And then the final thing I would talk about is that they're both talking about things that impress people. So the impressive pyramids, the fact they dominate the skyline, the fact that they're one of the wonders of the world. How is language used to get that across to the reader? And then in the other source, you've got the golden eagles, which are one of the most impressive birds that there are, and how is language used to describe how impressive they are. And I think that if you cover those 3 things with examples, then you'll have more than enough to write about in the 24 minutes that you've got.